One.
I'm going to start by saying that I'm female. I used to live next to an eye hospital. One day, walking home, I was stopped by an old man who clearly had hard time seeing. He asked me to help him cross the road to the hospital. I agreed, and he grabbed hold of my hand very tightly. At this point, I noticed his fingers were stained brown from tobacco, covered in scabs, and his fingernails were very long and dirty. I started to think that my good deed for the day was a bit regrettable. When we got to the other side of the road, he still had my hand grasped so tightly that I couldn't politely pull away. "Do you want to see my eye?" he said. One of his eyes was squeezed shut. With his free hand, he pulled the lids apart, and I realized, to my horror, that he had no eyeball, just an empty eye socket. I started babbling, and I was still trying to be polite, about how that was very interesting, but I had to go. Then he uttered the immortal words, "Do you want to put your finger in there?" He was pulling really hard at my hand, trying to force my fingers into his empty eye socket. At this point, I gave up on politeness and struggled my hand free. It was difficult because he was really strong, and then I just ran for it. I could still hear him laughing as I ran off.
Two.
I once had a gun pulled on me from point-blank range, pointed right between my eyes. I had knocked on the door of this gentleman to collect canned goods for the homeless, and the kicker was that I was a sophomore in high school at the time. He answered the door, saying, "What the fuck do you want?" The most disconcerting part wasn't the gun. It was after he put it away, he said, "Sorry, I thought you were my ex." My reaction was to run away.
Three.
I used to go to the University of Arizona in Tucson. One night, some friends and I decided to go to Mexico, which is across from Douglas, Arizona. It was a real nasty little town that we went to. I met some Mexican friends and a few girls we knew at this club. After the club was closed, most of our friends left us, and I was standing outside talking to one of the girls from the club, and a bunch of other drunk Mexicans started yelling at me, calling me gringo, and the usual other insults. I speak Spanish, so I knew what they were saying. They started walking towards me, throwing beer bottles, and on the other side of the street, a few policemen with shotguns, drawn, started walking towards me as well. The situation did not look very good for me at all. Me against about 12 people, plus who the heck knows what the police were going to do. I turned around and ran as fast as I could towards the border, with beer bottles whizzing past me and breaking near my feet. Luckily, I got to the border without getting my ass kicked or hit by any bottles. By the time I got to the U.S. border, the U.S. border guard saw the people and police following me and basically told me I was lucky to get out of there alive. I never went back down there again. A few months later, a Mexican-American friend of ours was killed in the same part of town.
Four.
When I was 18, I decided to drop out of high school to go with my girlfriend to Central America. I had been having a fantastic time, and besides getting groped by a super creepy old gentleman who grabbed at my crotch in Lyon, we were having no problems at all. I would say in general, people were nicer and kinder to us than I could have ever expected. Anyway, it was at the end of a long ride from a beach to Lyon, and in order to be able to make it back to Granada, where we were going to be spending the night, we were shuffled onto a bus where we really didn't know where we were going. Over the course of the bus ride, people began to filter off the bus. We didn't notice at first because it was over the course of a few stops, and we were trying to rest a bit. But by the time we got to the city of Managua, there was just about 4 or 5 other people on the bus. The sun had gone down. The bus was driving into areas where literally every structure was half-built concrete and metal sheets, and the streets were getting narrower and narrower. We saw at least 3 dead dogs on the side of the road, one of which was being eaten by another dog. And then we stopped looking out the windows. Eventually, the bus just stops. The driver quickly ushers us off of the bus, and then he locks the doors and drives away. So we look around, and the scene is out of a nightmare. I don't want to over-dramatize it, because in many ways it was the saddest and darkest place I've ever been, and there was a level of desperation that I can't fully comprehend. It was like if you took every terrifying drug addict you might meet in East Harlem at 5 a.m. on a Tuesday, every schizophrenic patient who had never received treatment of any kind, and every young opportunistic criminal you have ever met and left them to fend for years. One woman who sticks out in my mind was standing on a pile of cinder blocks, licking a downed power line with her eyes rolling back in her head. We stood there for a good 3 minutes, just saying under our breath to each other, "What are we gonna do? What are we gonna do?" Every cab that drove by ignored traffic lights and wouldn't stop for us, and then people started noticing that we were there. The true scariest moment was when people started coming out of their houses and just standing there staring directly at us. My girlfriend was on the verge of tears until finally this little old woman came running out of her house yelling, "What are you doing here?" in Spanish, of course, and grabs us and pulls us into her friend's shop, shouting and shooing away all the people who have crowded around us. She then told us that if we had walked 1 more block in any direction, we would have been robbed, beaten, or worse. She locked us in her shop until we could jump into a car that her friend had pulled up to the front of the shop in to take us somewhere safe.
Five.
One time, I was walking through Washington, D.C. to get to a restaurant. On my way there, as I was passing a man standing immediately to my left, my gaze was not involuntarily redirected to this person. In my peripheral view, I could see that he was gesturing towards me like he wished to speak with me. I turned to look him in the face, He had the most bewildered, wide-eyed, deer-in-the-headlights expression I've ever seen. He looked like he was witnessing a murder, and he just couldn't look away. This in itself was a little psychologically disturbing, because when you see someone's face contorted like that, you can't help but assume something tragic and horrifying is happening behind their eyes, and for a moment, get a glimpse at what they're feeling. It also had the compound effect of making you worry that there really is something dangerous happening nearby that is creating the response in the person you're looking upon. Maybe a remnant of our primitivistic monkey see, monkey do instincts, but I digress. That's not even the worst part, though. His mouth was moving. His toothless mouth was trying to utter words, but not a sound was coming out. He had the most dire look on his face, like he had the most urgent message to share with me. But his lips kept moving inaudibly, paired with his 1,000-yard stare. It felt kind of like that scene from Shutter Island, where Leonardo DiCaprio is entering the insane asylum for the first time, and he passes that creepy lady who looks at him and says, "Shh." Except that he kept moving his mouth, and he wasn't shushing me, and he was right next to my face. My composure thoroughly disrupted. I managed a nervous, sorry, and then I kept walking, occasionally glancing over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being followed. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the show. If you have a story to share, send us an email, like us on Facebook, share, like, and subscribe.